My name is Delilah Anderson. I'm 33 years old, currently living and working in San Francisco. That night, I returned to Boston on Thanksgiving in the old family mansion where I grew up, where I once believed I had a family. Everyone was gathered around the long dining table, candlelight flickering on the faces of people I used to call my own, though to me, they had been strangers for a long time. When my father, Richard Moore, stood and raised his glass, he announced he would hand over Moore Logistics, one of the leading transportation companies in America worth billions of dollars, to my two brothers, Thomas and Bradley. And me? He didn't mention my name even once. When my mother quietly asked, he brushed it aside. Daughters should only learn to please others. Don't dream of running a company. I sat in silence. I was used to being excluded. But just as applause broke out to congratulate my brothers, the television mounted on the wall suddenly switched to a live broadcast. The anchor's voice rang clear. Delilah Anderson, CEO of Lifeline AI, has just signed a contract worth $5.2 billion with the US government. Her breakthrough in cardiac diagnostic technology is expected to save millions of lives. The entire room froze. A wineglass slipped from my brother's hand, shattering on the floor. I simply smiled, calmly picked up my napkin, and dabbed my lips. If one day your family erased you, denied your place in every dream, would you stay silent or rise up to prove your worth? Share your thoughts in the comments, hit like if you've ever been dismissed, and don't forget to subscribe to follow the journey behind this $5.2 billion answer. The story has only just begun. I sat still in the room, glowing with candlelight, surrounded by faces long accustomed to ignoring me. The echo of the broadcast lingered like a bell that refused to fade. No one dared to speak. No one knew where to look. I didn't need anyone to say a word. Their eyes told the whole story. Shock, confusion, fear, and somewhere, shame that couldn't be hidden. But inside me, there was no storm. Every emotion had been buried long ago. Since childhood, when I curled up in the library with my first programming book, while my two brothers went fishing with my father and were called the heirs of the future. I used to wish he would look at me the way he looked at them. Proud eyes, a warm voice, a nod of recognition. But for me, there were only glances that slid past in different questions and countless times when he casually said, "Girls should learn homemaking. Technology isn't for women." I still remember when I was 16 and won first prize in the state science fair. My project was an early cardiac arrest warning device. That night, when I brought home the trophy, my father only said, "Sounds complicated. Can anyone even understand it?" Then he turned to ask Thomas about his basketball game at school. I stood there, trophy heavy in my hands, my heart falling to the ground. My mother looked at me briefly, as if she wanted to speak, but then she stayed silent, busying herself at the sink. I didn't ask to be spoiled, I only wanted to be heard. But every time I tried to share an opinion at family dinners, my father would cut me off. "Leave that to your brothers, Delilah," he'd say. "You think you understand business better than two finance majors?" Those words didn't just tear at my confidence, they taught me one truth. If I wanted respect, I had to leave that house. When I was accepted to MIT, I thought surely he would be proud. Instead, he shook his head. 4 years buried in machines for nothing. After graduation, you'll just write code for hire. That tuition is a waste. My mother only placed her hand gently on mine. "Just study for the experience, then find a good man to marry." I forced a smile, while the ache inside me had no words. I never expected money. I only wanted encouragement. But the day I graduated with a groundbreaking thesis on AI for early cardiac diagnosis, I sent home an email with the video of my defense before the expert panel. No reply. I called my mother. She said she was busy cleaning the yard, then hung up. After that, I packed away every expectation I had of my family and locked it deep inside. I rented the cheapest room I could find in Cambridge, worked in the cafeteria from 5 a.m., ran errands in the library in the afternoon, and freelanced coding at night. Some weeks I slept only 4 hours a day. Sometimes I was so exhausted that the moment I lay down, I jolted awake at the sound of the fire alarm in that rundown building. I remember standing in the greasy haze of an all-night diner, counting out crumpled tip money, wondering if it was worth it to chase an idea everyone at home called nonsense. But every time I thought of the father who said, "A girl doesn't need to understand running a company," I threw myself back into work like someone possessed. One winter night, when my computer broke, I couldn't afford repairs. I went to the campus library at 2 a.m., typing code in the freezing air. Outside, snow fell. I wore worn-out gloves and an old coat borrowed from a roommate. But inside, one fire burned bright. I would build something the world could not ignore, and I did. But what hurt more than silence was when Lifeline AI secured its first investment round. I wrote a 3-page handwritten letter home, pouring out my journey, hoping at least my mother would read it. No reply, no congratulations. I thought the letter was lost. Much later, I learned my mother had hidden it, never giving it to my father. She said, "He would have been furious to know you were still chasing something hopeless." I didn't blame her. Maybe she was only trying to survive in a marriage where her voice was never heard. I once thought the day would come when they'd be proud of me. But when I stood in that living room today, saw my father turn away, and heard him give everything to my brother's men who had never contributed a single innovative idea to the company, I finally understood. They never believed I would succeed. And when I did, they didn't want to admit it. Because to admit it would mean facing years of disdain, every insult, every stolen opportunity. So I stayed silent, not out of weakness, but because I had long since surpassed the narrow expectations they had set for me. The name Delilah Anderson is no longer a shadow behind two brothers. I became the one to rewrite my own legacy. And when that screen displayed $5.2 billion alongside my contract with the government, I no longer needed anyone's recognition. I had already claimed it myself, and that is something they will never take away. I started Lifeline AI in a room barely 100 square feet in a crumbling Cambridge building. With no proper desk, I used an upside-down cardboard box for my computer and a broken plastic chair propped up with stacks of newspaper. The first lines of code for that platform were written while most of the world slept, as I typed under the dim glow of a single bulb, filled with hope but also unnamed fear. Lifeline AI began as sketches on paper, a neural network capable of analyzing ECG data in real time, detecting early signs of cardiac conditions doctors might overlook. It sounded fanciful to many, especially coming from an unknown girl with no backing, nothing but a sleep-deprived mind and a heart both wounded and unyielding. I sent out more than 50 pitch decks to venture funds, startup accelerators, and advisors. Over half never replied. Most of the rest declined with the same phrases: not feasible, no market. Healthcare AI requires a team of physicians. Do you have that? I once entered a conference room in downtown Boston, clutching a simulation of arrhythmia my program had detected. I explained passionately. One of the three investors flipped through my packet, didn't read, then looked up and smirked. "You think you can replace doctors with a computer? A young woman writing some code is going to save lives? Be realistic, Miss Anderson." I walked out of that room with my throat burning, hands shaking not from rejection but from the way they dismissed the work itself, reducing me to nothing more than a silly dream in a dress. What followed was a long stretch with almost no funding. I sold my only old car to keep paying for high-speed internet and server hosting. Some months I lived on instant noodles week after week, patching algorithms while freelancing for pennies just to keep going. The night I nearly shut the platform down, I sat on the floor staring at my bank account balance, less than $100. My eyes stung from sleepless nights, my chest ached with a crushing thought. Maybe they were right. Maybe the world didn't need what I was building. But then an email arrived from a small community hospital in Amarillo, Texas. The head of emergency, Dr. Helena Cruz, wrote that she had reviewed a short pitch I'd sent months earlier through a remote AI in our program. They wanted to trial the beta system. I cried like a child, barely believing it. I called back that very night. Dr. Cruz answered, her voice steady. We have patients who need continuous monitoring. If your tool works as described, it could save real lives. Send us the access code. 3 days later, the system went live in Amarillo, connected to my laptop in that shabby room. Within 48 hours, it flagged 2 dangerous cardiac episodes missed by traditional monitors. Both patients survived, one, a 72-year-old man after valve surgery, the other, a young mother post-delivery with unnoticed, irregular rhythms. Helena called me that night, her voice hoarse but full of awe. You saved them, Delilah, not the machines. You and your mind. Those words were the most beautiful I had ever heard. Not out of pride, but because someone finally saw the true worth of what I had poured myself into. News spread in the local medical community. A small magazine ran a story. Soon, I received trial requests from clinics in Arizona, New Mexico, and Louisiana. A small VC firm called Halcyon Capital reached out after reading case reports citing my software. They offered a seed round of $750,000. I could hardly believe my eyes. Not for the number itself, but because someone was willing to take a bet with me. I poured everything into building my first team. Not star engineers from big corporations, but young graduates with passion. People carrying stories like mine, those once underestimated, once cast aside, yet still burning with ambition. We worked day and night in a shared rental space in Oakland. Every penny had to be calculated, but all of it fueled a fire that nothing could extinguish. 1 year after the system's very first trial, Lifeline AI was officially granted Phase 1 clinical approval by the FDA. News spread quickly through the medical community, and I saw an article about myself in the technology section of a national newspaper. I didn't call home, I didn't send the link, I didn't share it at all. Not because I wanted to hide it, but because I had stopped expecting anything from them. I had learned how to build everything without anyone standing behind me. And that became the foundation for stepping into the larger battle ahead, not just to create a company, but to prove that sometimes the ones most underestimated are the very ones who change the world. The dining room was decorated like a gala at a 5-star hotel, yet to me, everything was veiled by the haze of old memories. The crystal chandelier above cast its warm golden glow, reflecting off crystal glasses and antique Limoges porcelain plates my mother only brought out for special occasions. The long table was draped in white linen, each chair marked with a name card, and mine was nowhere to be found. I stood for a moment before sitting down. The chair to my mother's left remained empty. She glanced at me briefly, then looked away. Her hair was pinned high, she wore a pale blue silk gown, and on her wrist was the jade bracelet I once dreamed of inheriting as a child. She hadn't aged much, only her eyes had grown heavier, as though she had learned to avoid anything that might make her heart ache. My father sat at the head of the table, dressed in a light gray suit and a red striped tie, the symbol of authority he always chose for major decisions. My brothers Thomas and Bradley sat across from me, chatting and laughing together as though no one else was in the room. I wasn't surprised when my father opened the evening with a solemn tone. "Tonight," he said, raising a glass of Bordeaux, "is not only a time for our family to gather, but the moment I formally pass on the legacy my father and I built for more than 40 years." I saw Thomas squeeze his wife's shoulder while Bradley leaned forward, eyes gleaming as if he already knew the script. I remained silent, hands resting loosely in my lap, gaze steady. All legal documents have been prepared, my father continued, and will be signed after the holiday. Thomas will serve as CEO, while Bradley will be appointed Vice President of Strategic Expansion. More logistics will remain under the guidance of the men of this family. I wasn't surprised. Not at all. My mother adjusted the napkin on her lap, her hand trembling so slightly I thought only I noticed. No one looked my way, not a single glance, not a word of inclusion, not even a symbolic gesture of place. A breath escaped me. My father paused, his eyes flicking over me for exactly 1 second, as though suddenly remembering I was in the room. Delilah, he said, his voice dropping, you chose a different path. Technology, startups, things that, he shrugged slightly, don't align with the family's direction. I tilted my head, raised an eyebrow faintly, but didn't respond. But, of course, he went on, everyone has their own role. A family still needs those who preserve tradition. A woman who chooses the right husband, who builds a peaceful home. He smiled. Have you thought about settling down? The clink of silverware against plates ceased. I laid my napkin on the table slowly. You're right, Father. Everyone does have a role. Some build factories, some write technology that saves lives remotely without needing a hospital visit. And some, I met his eyes directly, don't need to be chosen to create value greater than an entire corporation. Thomas frowned slightly. Bradley forced a laugh, clearly uneasy. My mother blinked, her fingers tightening around the stem of her glass. My father crossed his arms, leaning back in his chair, gaze steady. I understand you're upset. But major decisions cannot be driven by emotion. Business requires realism. More logistics is the lifeblood of the men in this family, and it always will be. Lifeblood, I repeated. The lifeblood that had me working unpaid shifts in the warehouse at 17 to learn operations, while Thomas was flown to Miami for a national logistics conference. You still remember that? He chuckled lightly. That was a lesson. Everyone has different experiences. My experience was watching both brothers pursue MBAs on family scholarships, while I had to take out loans just to attend MIT. Eating instant noodles through winter just to pay for server space. You chose that path, he said firmly. You didn't need me. Number. I didn't, I replied evenly. But that doesn't mean you didn't have the chance to be a different kind of father. The table fell silent. The grandfather clock ticked, each sound sharp in the tense air. Thomas finally spoke, breaking the stillness. We're here for Thanksgiving, not to dig up the past. I looked at him, my smile thin as a blade. What is there to be more thankful for than the truth? Bradley clicked his tongue. We're discussing the company's future. Could you save the emotions until after dinner? I set down my glass, eyes calm. What are you so afraid of? I asked softly. Afraid that the woman once cast aside might be the only one in this room capable of making Forbes strike both of your names off the list of rightful heirs. My mother startled. Delilah, you're going too far. I turned to her. You never said a word when I was excluded from every family meeting, when my name vanished from the Christmas cards. When every article about Lifeline AI came out, you never sent a message. Not because you didn't see, but because you chose silence. Her throat worked as if words were trapped there. I no longer expected anything from her, and that made my next words come lightly, like air. Silence is also a choice, Mother. My father leaned forward. You may succeed out there, but don't mistake that for a right to judge how this family is run. I tilted slightly. But it gives me the right to question the definition of family you're clinging to. Every gaze in the room turned to me. I picked up my napkin, dabbed my lips, then lifted my head. Congratulations to my brothers. Congratulations to you, Father. And thank you for reminding me yet again that there are houses we grow up in, but never belong to. I rose, the scrape of the chair echoing in the suffocating silence. I didn't look back. I had walked through far darker shadows than this, and I wasn't afraid of them anymore. I hadn't reached the doorway when Emma's voice rang out from the living room, bright and innocent. "Aunt Delilah, you're on television. Come quick." I turned, my face unchanged, though my heart clenched. The house sank into uneasy silence. Eyes flickered awkwardly. Thomas and Bradley shot each other a glance before quickly standing, as if scrambling to control the moment. My father's grip tightened on his glass, veins rising in his wrist. My mother pressed her lips into a polite smile, but her eyes betrayed her. I walked slowly into the living room. Emma, Thomas's daughter, sat cross-legged on the rug beneath the giant flat-screen television. The remote was clutched in her hand, her wide eyes fixed on the screen. There, Forbes was broadcasting live coverage of the press conference held earlier that morning in San Francisco. The anchor's voice was crisp and firm. Delilah Anderson, founder and CEO of Lifeline AI, has officially entered the top 10 youngest female billionaires in the United States, with an estimated net worth of $5.2 billion, following a nationwide partnership with the Department of Health. Her AI-powered cardiac diagnostic platform has been trialed in more than 80 hospitals across the country over the past 2 years and has delivered groundbreaking results in early detection. On screen, I stood at the podium in a simple ash gray suit framed by the Lifeline AI logo and the US seal. The stage lights caught my face calm, focused, nothing like the girl once told she should only find a suitable husband. Whispers rippled behind me. A dish clattered to the floor, likely Bradley's. I stood still, watching myself on the screen, feeling as though I were seeing a stranger, a woman composed, self-assured, no longer needing anyone's validation. "Are you really a billionaire, Aunt?" Emma looked up, her innocent question freezing the room. "This isn't some joke, right?" I knelt, smoothing her hair, my eyes still on the screen. "It's not a joke, Emma. But it's not magic either. It was built on sleepless nights and tears." My father entered, trying to hold steady, but I saw the redness in his eyes. He stopped, bracing, a hand on the sofa, as if to steady himself. Forbes continued to roll clips of my interview me, describing how Lifeline AI began with almost nothing, about the first patients who survived because of the platform, and about our commitment to bring advanced healthcare technology to underserved rural areas. "I can't believe it," Bradley murmured, his face pale. "People have been talking about you all afternoon, and no one in this house follows technology," I cut in. "That has never changed." Thomas stepped closer, hands in his pockets, feigning composure. "Delilah, you could have at least told us? If it was such a big deal, the family should have known." I turned toward him, my gaze not angry, only cold as a December night. "When I sent the first Lifeline presentation home, did you reply? Or when I wrote that I needed a co-founder to qualify for Halcyon Capital funding, how long did you stay silent?" Thomas had no words. I turned to Bradley. "And you? You once sat in my dorm room asking to borrow my final semester code. Do you remember what you said when I asked if you wanted to invest?" "This is only good for science fiction movies," Bradley faltered, searching for words, but my mother stepped in, voice soft as if to soothe. "I always believed you'd do something extraordinary. I just didn't want to see you hurt if it didn't work out." I turned to her. "The deepest hurt isn't failure, Mother. It's giving everything you have and still being treated as invisible." The room fell into silence. Forbes had shifted to interviews with doctors using the Lifeline AI system, their words clear and deeply moving. "She saved my life," one patient said, eyes brimming. "Without that software, I wouldn't have lived long enough to see my grandchild born." Those words weren't meant for me, yet they cut through the distance between me and my family like a blade. To them, value was always measured by what they understood. Anything they didn't understand, they dismissed as nonsense, as childish games. My father suddenly spoke. 5.2 billion. And you don't think you should share any of that with the family? I turned toward him. I once wanted to share everything, but only when I still believed I was part of this family. His grip tightened on the chair. I was wrong not to see what was taking shape. But what you achieved still comes from the foundation of this family. Without more logistics, you wouldn't know what it means to operate, to manage, to bid contracts. I gave a faint smile, not bitter, only calm truth. I learned operations from 12-hour warehouse shifts without a contract. I learned negotiation when I convinced investors with no one backing me. I learned survival from dinners like this. His eyes dimmed. My mother sank back into her chair, a hand pressed against her chest as if holding something from spilling out. I sat beside Emma, picked up the remote, and muted the television. The room went still. The old mahogany side table gave off a woody scent that pulled me back to years spent alone in the library, clutching my laptop, loneliness thick as smoke around me. "Aunt," Emma whispered, "are you sad that no one saw how good you are?" I squeezed her shoulder gently, my gaze moving to my father, my mother, my brothers who refused to meet my eyes. "It doesn't matter, Emma. When you truly do what you believe is right, other people's eyes no longer define your worth." And I smiled, not cold, not waiting, only the smile of someone who had walked through darkness and now stood where no one expected. I was about to head upstairs when the library door creaked open. A pool of warm yellow light spilled out, clashing with the chill that had begun to settle in the old house. My father's voice came, not loud but clear enough to stop me. "Delilah, come in. We need to talk." I paused at the threshold. He had used that room as a fortress for 4 decades, where every major family decision was made behind thick wood and the scent of old tobacco. I stepped inside and closed the door. My father sat behind a walnut desk, holding a glass of whiskey untouched, staring at me as if waiting for a confession. I said nothing, just pulled out the chair across and sat down. "Don't you think you should have shared with your parents when your company grew that big?" His tone wasn't angry but cold, like he was addressing an opponent at the negotiating table. "Did you ever ask me about anything?" I answered softly. "Anything at all?" His lip curled. "Don't twist this. It's not about whether I cared, it's about you deliberately hiding." I exhaled, neither smiling nor accusing. I didn't hide. Everything I did was public. Forbes didn't pull news from my diary. Anyone could have read it. "Family isn't anyone. You didn't tell us." He leaned back, swirling the whiskey in his hand. "Or is it because you feel above us now? That, with money, you don't need family anymore?" I met his eyes. "I needed you once. Desperately. But you were the first to make me believe I wasn't worth needing." His face slackened for a moment, but instead of softening, he pressed harder. "You call that success? A medical product not even fully through trials being praised everywhere? Tech bubble, Delilah? Things like that always burst." I tilted my head, voice steady. "If it bursts, that risk is mine, not the family's, not more logistics. And if it does, how much shame will the Anderson name carry?" I leaned back slightly, arms crossed. "You never wanted to be tied to anything I did. And now you're worried about reputation? You're mocking me?" I paused. "I'm showing you the contradiction in your thinking. When I started with $200 and an old laptop, you said I was wasting time. When I raised millions in funding, you called it a bubble. When Forbes put me on the list of influential people, you claimed I was disgracing the family." "'Cause I worry about you," he said, voice rising. "You're still young. You don't know the consequences of reckless decisions." "You're not worried about me," I replied. "You're worried about the reputation you built. A reputation that had no place for a daughter who forged her own path outside your design." He fell silent. For a moment, I saw his hand tremble. The glass shook slightly, maybe from age. Or maybe because for the first time he wasn't in control of the conversation. The door opened suddenly. Thomas stood there, entering without knocking. His eyes flickered, avoiding mine. I'm sorry, he said to our father, then turned to me. Delilah, there's something you should know. I waited. Do you remember when you sent me your first startup plan and asked if I wanted to invest? I nodded. You refused. Said you didn't want to get caught up in science fiction. Thomas swallowed. It wasn't because I didn't believe in you. It was because Dad told me if I helped you, I'd be cut out of the will. I froze. My eyes never left my father's face. He didn't deny it. He stared into his glass as if it held something more important than his daughter's gaze. I had just been promoted to the board, Thomas added, faltering. I was scared of losing it all, and I was allowed to lose it all. My voice was calm, but each word struck like a hammer. I was wrong, Thomas said. Now I see. You didn't need anyone in this house to rise. I turned to my father. See? I didn't hide. Every door was closed in my face. I once thought I wasn't good enough. Now I understand I was never given the chance to prove it. He set down his glass, the soft clink against the desk, cutting the silence. He said nothing. Didn't admit, didn't deny, just silence. A refusal louder than words. I rose. Whose name is in your will is your choice. But don't call it concern for me. Call it what it is, control. Exclusion, denial. I walked to the door. Thomas still stood there. I looked at him, neither blaming nor forgiving. You had a choice, I said quietly, and you chose safety. He didn't argue, only nodded. I left the room, not slamming the door because I didn't need to. Some doors had locked themselves long ago, and those inside just hadn't realized it. As I stepped out, my mother stood in the hall, hands clasped at her chest, eyes shifting as I passed. Her uneven breathing betrayed what she tried to hide. Delilah, she whispered as my hand touched the stair rail. Her voice was so small it barely carried. I turned, looking at the face I once believed was the safest place, the one I had run to whenever teased or hurt as a child. Now, that faith felt fractured. I want to talk, she said haltingly. Alone, I nodded after a pause. She led me to the master bedroom at the end of the hall, her private retreat. It looked just as I remembered, white lace curtains with golden trim, silk bedding, a tidy vanity with old perfume bottles. I don't know where to begin, she said, her back to me. But I think I have to say this. I leaned against the door frame, waiting. There was no need to rush anymore. Do you remember? She turned to face me. When you were at MIT, how you used to write me letters? My chest tightened. I remember. Once a month. Each one 3 pages long. She nodded softly. Did you ever get a reply? No, I said evenly, and it took me a long time to stop blaming myself for that. Her hands clenched together. I read them all, every word, but I never wrote back. I locked them away in a drawer. The room fell still. I looked past her, out the window where holiday lights sparkled in the garden. I remembered stringing those lights myself every year while the rest of the family prepared the feast. I was afraid, she continued, voice trembling. Afraid that if your father knew you kept pursuing technology, refusing to turn back, he'd cut you off completely. I thought, if you came home one day, if you gave it up, I'd show you the letters and tell you I kept them. I looked at her. And if I never came home? She fell silent. So, you gambled that I'd abandon myself just to earn his approval, I said slowly. You never thought that maybe those letters were the only thing holding me together all those years. Her head bowed, tears slipping silently. I didn't cry. I had no tears left for what belonged to the past. I was wrong, she whispered. I just wanted peace in the house. I hoped if you succeeded, your father would be proud. But I never thought you'd have to walk that path entirely alone. I looked at her and I didn't see a powerful mother. I saw a woman who had lost her voice in this house long ago. You've been silent too long, I said. You don't have to be anymore. We didn't say anything more. I turned and walked out of the room. When I opened the door, the last person I wanted to see was standing right there in the hallway. Bradley. He leaned against the wall opposite, hands shoved in his pockets, head bowed. When I came closer, he lifted his face, eyes rimmed red. The last time I had seen him cry was when Mom forbade him from going to prom because of his bad grades. "There's something you need to hear," he said quietly, "and I think I can't hide it anymore." I didn't answer. I just stood still. "Do you remember the first design for your cardiac data analysis software?" He raised his eyes to me. "That diagram you drew by hand with an ink pen on scrap paper, then pinned to the board in your old apartment?" I nodded. "I stayed awake 3 nights straight to map that flow." He swallowed hard. "I took a photo of it, and I used it in my MBA graduation project presentation." My heart froze for a beat. I stared at his face, but there was no anger left. Only a strange exhaustion. "I didn't think it would lead to anything," he continued. "At the time, I was terrified I wouldn't score high enough to be accepted into the internship program in Minneapolis. My presentation was too weak, but your design was flawless." I drew in a deep breath. "And did you tell anyone it was mine?" He shook his head, like a child caught cheating in front of his teacher. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked. "Because after the Forbes report," he said, "I was invited to a tech symposium. They asked me about the system diagram, about real-world applications." I couldn't answer. I realized every bit of success I've had since then has been standing on your work. I stayed silent. "I was wrong," he went on, "and I don't want to keep living off that mistake. If you want to make this public, I won't stop you." I turned away, the hallway light casting a long beam across the wooden floor, dividing the space between us. "For years, you stood on Father's side. Where you stand now is your choice," I said, "not with blame, not with forgiveness." "I don't need confessions, I need action." Bradley bowed his head. "I understand." I walked on toward the stairs. Inside, I felt no relief. But the volcano of anger was gone. What remained was clarity that everything I had once suspected, once sensed, now had a name. And truth, however painful, is always the beginning of renewal. The next morning, breakfast was set as if the storm of the night before had never happened. The smell of waffles drifted down the hallway. Coffee brewed in the old French press Father insisted on keeping in its usual spot. I sat alone by the dining room window, eyes on the back garden just tipping into winter, bare branches, standing proud as if they needed no protection. The house was quieter than usual, perhaps because words once spoken cannot be taken back. Cracks in the bonds thought to be sealed by blood now showed clearly in daylight, with no room left for pretense. My father walked in, dressed as though he were about to head into a major meeting. His eyes flicked to me for a moment, then to the table. "We should talk," he said, his voice unusually calm. I nodded, sliding the coffee cup toward him. He didn't sit, just stood beside the table, hands clasped in front of him. "The family needs unity again. What's past can't be changed. But now, we can try to rebuild." I looked up at him. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "More logistics is moving into operational technology. With what you've achieved, if you agree to transfer part of your assets into a joint investment fund, we could use it to restructure everything. Shareholders would feel more secure seeing your name tied to the company. It builds trust." "Trust for whom?" I asked evenly. "The market or you." He hesitated, then pressed on. "You could be senior advisor. The title doesn't matter. What matters is the image, a unified family, the next generation continuing the last. I smiled faintly, not out of scorn, but because it sounded too smooth, like a speech rehearsed long ago, waiting for my approval to become a press release. I appreciate that you finally think my name could be tied to the family's reputation, I said. But I already have another plan. My father frowned. What plan? I picked up the iPad on the table, opened the site I had spent months preparing, and turned the screen toward him. Across the top it read, Anderson Future Works Fund, opening doors for women to build America's tech future. I've created a $20 million fund, I said slowly, for American women starting out in STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math. Women with no one behind them, no relatives on a board, women with ideas no one listens to. He fell silent. He just stared at the screen, the glow highlighting every line on his face I didn't remember seeing before. I won't pour money into a corporation that once erased me from its will for being different, I continued. But I will use my money to give chances to those treated as I was. This is your revenge? His voice dropped low. I looked at him, strangely calm. Number, this is how I end the cycle. I don't need anyone here to bow their head. I just want something new to grow from the ruins. My mother appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of chamomile tea. I didn't know how long she had been listening, but her eyes no longer avoided mine. She stepped forward, glanced at the screen, then looked at me. Who do you want on the board of directors? She asked. I didn't hesitate. I want you. The room froze. My father turned to her, clearly expecting an immediate refusal. But she said nothing. She set the tea on the table, sat beside me, lifted her chin, her eyes no longer trembling like they had the night before. I agree, she said. It's time I had a voice. My father stepped back, disbelief in his eyes. My mother placed her hand firmly on the table, her voice steady enough to slice through the heavy air. I've stood by you for over 40 years. Never once was I invited to a company meeting. Never once was my opinion asked on family decisions. Now, my daughter, the one you called the misfit, asks me to help build something meaningful. I don't need to think twice, Richard. I didn't look at him. I looked at her. And in her eyes, I saw a new light, not caution, not repressed hope, but courage, blooming after decades of silence. I'll read every report, she added. I'll learn to manage, to oversee capital. I'm not young, but I'm not foolish. I can learn, and I want to contribute to something I believe is right. My father turned away and left without a word, his tall frame still imposing, but something in his steps lacked the steadiness of before, perhaps because he no longer controlled the game. My mother and I stayed, side by side, in silence. She held my hand, squeezed gently. That hand had steadied me when I learned to walk, had soothed me after nightmares. But today, it didn't tremble in the shadow of the man who had always claimed absolute power in this house. Some battles don't need victory to prove worth. They only need someone brave enough to step out of safety and begin again. My mother had done that. And for the first time, we stood on the same side, not as daughter needing shelter or mother needing protection, but as two women rewriting what a family could become. That evening, the house seemed larger than usual, not because there were fewer people, but because the distance between them had been redrawn. No one said it aloud, but everyone sensed the center of the family had shifted. No longer anchored at the head of the table where my father sat, but moving elsewhere to the place where a long silenced voice was rising clearer than ever. I said nothing when everyone gathered in the living room that night. My mother sat beside me, her gaze calm, while Thomas and Bradley stayed across, quiet, as though they knew there was no way to turn back or sidestep what was coming. My father entered last, still in a dark suit and neat tie, but his face carried a strain he couldn't hide. There was something in his eyes that betrayed he sensed, though he wouldn't admit it, that things were slipping beyond his control. I opened the laptop already set on the table. No lengthy preamble. I spoke just one sentence. This is the recording of Father's private meeting with Thomas and Bradley last February. I didn't mean to capture it, but because the call happened while I was overseeing the West Warehouse audio system remotely, it was saved by accident, and I kept it. The entire room fell silent as the recording played. My father's voice, dry and sharp, rang out. Women should only marry and have children. Don't let Delilah ruin the system we're building. She may be good at technology, but let her go write software. The company belongs to men. She'll never be good enough to run something of the scale of more logistics. The silence that followed didn't last. It was broken by the sound of someone swallowing hard, by my mother's quickened breath, by Emma's small, astonished voice. Did they really say that about Aunt Delilah? I looked at my father. He didn't speak, didn't rise, didn't deny it. He just stared at the screen as though hoping it was some technical trick. But truth, when spoken in one's own voice, carries a weight no illusion can erase. I shut the laptop. Silence still filled the room, but it was no longer cautious silence. It was the silence of an iceberg surfacing, forcing everyone to face it, unable to look away. I don't need an apology, I said slowly. But from now on, words like that will no longer be whispered in the dark. Everyone has heard them now, even the shareholders. My father lifted his eyes. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and rough. You leaked that? I neither nodded nor shook my head. I sent it to the board members of More Logistics, so they would have full context before next week's strategy meeting. As for how it ended up on social media, I don't know who shared it. Thomas glanced at me, then at our father, his face unsettled. I didn't share it, he said quickly. But clearly, someone on the board did. And now, everyone's talking, Bradley snapped, clinging to anything he could. Family matters being dragged into the public like this. I cut him off. No, family matter should be based on humiliating one of its members, especially when that person is the daughter of the one speaking. My father looked at me. His once steely eyes held something different now, not remorse, perhaps fatigue, or the dawning realization that he had misread the times. You think you've won, he said, not angry, but cold as frost. I held his gaze for a long moment before answering. Number, I didn't play this game to win. I only stood up from the chair of someone dismissed, and walked into the room I was never invited to, even though it was the room of my own family. My mother laid her hand over mine, her eyes steady for once. You had every right. Everyone has the right to speak the truth after being silenced too long. My father stayed quiet. He stood, walked to the door, but stopped. His back hunched slightly, shoulders heavy. He didn't turn. His shadow stretched across the wall, large but no longer solid. Richard, my mother called, her voice soft but clear. Do you have anything to say to her? He was silent for a few seconds. Then, barely audible, he said, I need time. I didn't answer. I didn't need anything more from him at that moment. What needed to be said had already been spoken in the sound, in the looks, in the presence of a family that once thought silence was the way to keep peace. But sometimes, only truth, however painful, has the power to melt what seemed unshakable. And from that moment on, everything would finally be seen in the light. No more closed-door meetings, no more decisions made in the dark. Only truth, and those willing to stand for it. A year later, winter returned to Boston with its cutting chill. I sat in the Lifeline AI office in San Francisco, the glow from rows of servers like streaks of stars in the night. The phone had been ringing constantly for weeks, but this call carried a different weight. The screen read, More Logistics, Board of Directors, I answered. The voice of Frederick Collins, the board's chairman, was clear. Miss Anderson, More Logistics has reached crisis. Last quarter's revenue dropped over 40%. International contracts are being canceled. Thomas and Bradley have lost the market's trust. We need a strong hand to restructure. The board has unanimously agreed to invite you back. I was silent for a moment. Memories flooded back how many times I'd been denied entry into that very boardroom. How often I'd been reminded the company was the legacy of men, and now the same people who once cast me aside were extending an invitation. "I'll consider it," I said briefly, then hung up. But the truth was, I already knew my answer. 2 weeks later, I walked into the Boston headquarters. The building that was once my father's pride now felt hollow. The grand lobby was quiet, only a few receptionists clinging to professional smiles. Old photographs on the walls, my father in his suit, Thomas and Bradley flanking him, were coated in dust, stripped of their former glory. In the large boardroom, all the shareholders waited. Their eyes followed me as I entered, no longer skeptical, but expectant. Thomas and Bradley sat at the far end, faces drawn. Bradley avoided my eyes. Thomas tried to look composed, but his hand trembled against the table. "Mr. Collins began. We've deliberated carefully. We believe only you can lead more logistics out of this crisis. We're prepared to hand over full control to you." Thomas lifted his head, voice taut. "You're coming back just to prove you're better than us?" "We did everything we could." I met his gaze. "No one denies you tried, but trying without ability only sinks the ship faster." "And you let it sink." Bradley spoke hoarsely. "If you take control, Father will never forgive you. He still believes this company is the lifeblood of men." I drew in a breath, then turned to the board. "I'll accept, but on one condition. More Logistics will no longer exist as an independent entity. It will become the logistics division of Lifeline AI. All facilities, staff, and assets will be integrated to support the development of the national medical technology infrastructure." The room erupted. Some shocked, some exchanging glances, but none voicing firm opposition. They were too worn down by repeated losses. For them, survival was enough. Thomas shot up from his chair. "You're stealing it outright." I turned calmly. "No, Thomas. I'm turning a sinking ship into part of a larger vessel strong enough to weather storms. You can call it theft, but the market will call it rebirth." Mr. Collins tapped the table firmly. "I support this. Lifeline AI has vision. More Logistics needs renewal. If we stay the course, the company will be bankrupt in 3 months. This agreement saves us all." Bradley slumped back, defeated. Thomas still wanted to argue, but seeing the majority nodding, he bit his lip and swallowed his words. After the meeting, I stepped onto the balcony overlooking Boston under a thin layer of snow. My father was there, quietly watching. He hadn't joined the session, but he must have heard everything. "You planned this all along," he said, voice slower, more tired than before. I turned to him. "I didn't plan to destroy. I only did what you never believed I could. Look beyond the shadow of more Logistics." He gripped the railing. "This company was my everything. Your grandfather's everything. It's our bloodline." I held his eyes. "Number, it's your legacy, and I built mine. Now you're forced to witness the two merging, not the way you wanted, but the way I chose." He didn't answer. The cold wind swept in, carrying salt from the harbor. His figure bent, aged. I didn't feel triumph. Only a quiet sorrow, like watching an old building torn down to make way for something new. A month later, a new sign stood at headquarters. Lifeline AI, Division of Smart Logistics. Mint green replaced the traditional red. Inside, young Lifeline engineers worked, side by side with more logistics veterans. The freight containers now carried not only goods, but advanced systems for storing pharmaceuticals and medical technology. At the launch event, I stood at the podium before hundreds of employees and shareholders. Television cameras broadcast live across economic channels. My voice was steady. Today, we are not saying goodbye to more logistics. We are saying hello to a new chapter where logistics is not just about transport, but the backbone of public health. From here on, every shipment isn't just a number, but possibly the life of a patient waiting for medicine, the hope of a family praying for good news from a hospital. Thunderous applause filled the hall. I spotted my mother in the front row, her eyes alight, nothing like the silence of the past. She was now a board member of the Anderson Future Works Fund, and today she also sat on the project's coordinating team. My father wasn't there, I wasn't surprised, but I knew he was listening, and perhaps deep down he understood that his legacy had taken on a new shape, one he had once rejected. I stood there, watching the Lifeline AI flag fly next to the old More Logistics flag, my heart no longer heavy. Not because I had won, but because I had changed the rules of the game. From that moment on, no one could erase me from the story I had written with my own blood and intellect. The following Christmas, the ancestral house in Boston was lit once more. Snow fell on the porch, blanketing the steps and the tall pines. There was no loud laughter, no booming toasts like in years past. The air was quiet, cautious, as though each person carried a private burden they couldn't yet name. The living room glowed warm with the firelight. On the wall-mounted screen, the live year-end broadcast played. My image appeared, standing at a podium in Washington, with the words behind me, "The woman who changed American healthcare, Delilah Anderson." The anchor's voice rang. Lifeline AI has officially saved over 30,000 patients this year alone, while opening global prospects for applying artificial intelligence to medical diagnostics. The woman behind this success, CEO Delilah Anderson, has just been honored by Time magazine in the list of the year's 100 most influential people worldwide. In the room, no one spoke. My father sat in an armchair near the window, smaller now, his hair whiter than before. His eyes were locked on the screen, where I smiled and shook hands with the Secretary of Health. My words echoed. Legacy is not what we inherit, but what we create. And it is not found in assets passed down, but in the values we leave for those who come after us. My mother sat across, eyes shimmering with tears. She looked at me on the screen, then at him, as if asking, "Do you hear this? Do you understand now?" But my father gave no answer. He only sat silently, his hands tightening on the armrest, his gaze a mixture of pride, regret, and something beyond words. Thomas and Bradley sat together, gone were their arrogant, confident airs. Failure had aged them, humbled them. Both still held positions in the new operational branch of Lifeline AI, but no longer at the top. They had learned to listen instead of only commanding. Suddenly, Emma rushed over, holding a silver laptop. She was 16 now, taller than last year, but her eyes still shone with passion. "Aunt Delilah," she said, "I wrote a small program, but it keeps breaking. Can you take a look?" I smiled and reached for the computer. On the screen were clumsy lines of Python code, loops that didn't work, but ideas that were surprisingly clever. Emma looked at me nervously. "I want to be as good as you. I want to build something useful for the world." I nodded gently, placing my hand on her shoulder. "You've already started, Emma. What matters now is whether you have the patience to see it through." The room stayed silent, watching. Perhaps they realized something they had missed before. No one has the right to extinguish ambition, whether it comes from a 16-year-old girl or from a woman once pushed away from her own family's table. Outside, the church bells rang for midnight mass. I looked around the room, once filled with so much pain, and wondered, what do people choose when faced with the past? Do they cling to resentment and imprison themselves, or do they use those very wounds to open a future they alone can shape? The answer didn't need to be spoken. It was in Emma's shining eyes, in my mother's tearful smile, and in my father's heavy silence that still carried acceptance. But what about you? If it were you, which path would you choose? Would you keep holding on to old wounds or turn them into strength to build a new road for yourself and those who come after? I would love to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments because every story, every perspective has its own value. And if you care about stories of family, about journeys to reclaim your voice and your true worth, subscribe to the channel. More stories will come, stories in which you may see yourself and perhaps find the strength to continue writing your own.